Welcome to Babushka, a method for developing games in Unity. This is an extreme explaining tutorial. Why do we need a method for developing games in Unity? If you have any experience of making non-trivial games, you know that the real problem is complexity. Without techniques for handling complexity, your program will be complicated, messy and buggy. It will be hard to understand, maintain and extend. Complexity has been a huge problem in software engineering. During the last 70 years, different techniques for handling complexity have emerged. One such technique is OOP, Object-Oriented Programming. It is based on the concept of objects. Objects are instantiated from classes. Classes use inheritance for code reuse and extensibility. Another technique is CBA, Component-Based Architecture. Here you're assembling complex objects by adding reusable, independent components. In Unity, the OOP and CBA are built into the game engine itself. Look at OOP. When you write your own code, you will be able to use the functionality of hundreds of pre-made classes. Look at CBA. In Unity, the complex objects of CBA are called game objects, and the reusable components are called simply components. Here you see only 4 components, but there are hundreds of components to choose from. As we said, OOP and CBA are already built into Unity game engine. You are forced to use them whether you want it or not. And there is no reason for not wanting to use them. It does facilitate development of games. Without them, it would be very hard indeed to make games. To these 2 techniques you can add your own techniques. One is ST, stepwise development. You break the problem down into small pieces and develop each one methodically. You do not try to understand and do all the pieces at once. Instead, you first develop a small piece and then use that piece as a stepping stone for the next piece, and so on. To cut the complex problem into smaller pieces and do one piece at a time is something natural. We do it more or less instinctively. But the real question is, where to make the cuts? After all, there is more than one way to cut a cake. The most natural way to make the cuts is to use test cases. And that leads us to the next technique, which is TDD, Test-Driven Development. In TDD, you define your test cases before you write your code. As you write your program, you repeatedly test your code against the test cases. In other words, you're using test cases as a guidance for breaking up your game into small pieces and for writing your code. In summary, these 4 techniques, OOP, CBA, ST and TDD, is what I use when I develop games in Unity. Let's take a closer look at my method. When I started to develop games in Unity as an indie, I noticed that I used certain patterns. After a while, I thought that it could be a good idea to formalize the patterns into a method and give it a name. I called it the Babushka method for 2 reasons. First, because I divided the development process into small pieces. Each piece consisted of 2 parts, just like a Babushka doll. First, a setup part, where I assembled my game objects, and then a code part, where I wrote my code and tested the piece. The setup part was based on CBA, while the code and test part was based on OOP and TDD. I started with a small piece. Then I used that piece as a starting point for the next piece. It was like putting a small Babushka doll inside a bigger one. And I kept on developing my game into bigger pieces until my whole game was done. It was like putting babushka dolls inside each other until the final babushka doll appeared. And this way of developing is, of course, the stepwise development, SG, that we mentioned earlier. Let's summarize. First, using the test cases as your guide, break the problem down into small pieces that can be developed and tested one at a time. Then choose the first piece. Then set up the piece by creating the needed game objects. Then code the piece by writing the code for each game object above that has a script component. Then test that the piece works as intended. Then go to the next piece. Iterate until the whole game is completed. In order to support my development method, I write two documents. In the first one, setup.txt, I have a list of needed game objects. In the second, the scripts.txt, I make comments that describe what the scripts need to do. Having these two documents is a big help when I later start to implement the game. Here is an example of these two documents for the Pong game. In the setup.txt, you see a numbered list of the different pieces. Each piece corresponds to a test case. The first piece is to get the ball to bounce around. The next piece is to make the player pedal move around, and so on. Under each piece we have a list of the needed game objects. For instance, for the first piece we have a reference, a background, a ball, and so on. And under each game object we see the needed components. The ball, for instance, needs a box collider 2D, a rigid body 2D, a script, and so on. If we now look at the second document, scripts.txt, we see the same pieces. Make the ball bounce around, make the player pedal move, and so on. But this time we have a list of needed scripts. For the first piece, we see that we need to write a script for our ball. And we see what this script needs to do. Serve the ball with constant speed in random direction, and handle the collisions with goals and walls. And so on for the other pieces. You have now seen an abstract description of my method. But to really get to know it and see the real power of it, you will have to see how I use it in practice to build games. But that we will do in other tutorials. That's everything for this tutorial. Thank you for watching.